fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and Mr. Michael Hawley's here. So it's
correct.
It's a non-fiction fiction day. It's a fictional all things history, and because Michael was around back in the 1800s, so he's got a lot of memories, and he's
eyewitness. That's right, eyewitness of history, and that's what we need here. So, but I'm excited about this. This is historical fiction, so I love this.
Perfect. Now we are talking about Walk the Earth as Brothers, novel that came out in April 9th of 2024, and the writer is here with us. That's Henry Rozycki. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Nice speaking with you.
So, Henry, let's start out with the novel, and let's talk about what's the basic premise of the novel, and then we'll get into the history of it.
So basically, it is the intertwined story of two brothers who, like a lot of young men, have dreams and ambitions. They happen to be from Poland. They happen to be Jewish, and so in 1939. Events interfered with those dreams and ambitions. And the story is that one of them ends up on the western side of things in France, and the other one ends up on the eastern side of things, eventually in the Siberian Gulag. And it interweaves simultaneously, like in the same time frame, what happens to them and how they struggle to survive, and at the same time what that struggle does to them as people, as young men, what happens to their dreams and ambitions. And if they survive, which, spoiler alert, they do, what are they like at the afterwards? So it finishes about 10 years after the war.
Well, what drew you into writing this? Like, was there something that happened that you...
Yeah, so it is based, I love to see it, based on true story. It is and it isn't. The person who ended up in France was my father. The person who ended up in Russia was my uncle. The problem was that there seemed to be a decision made by my family before I was born that they weren't going to talk about anything. So I grew up knowing a few facts that got sprinkled in inadvertently, but a lot of the story I didn't know. And as a child, one tends to be curious about one's family and where they came from. But when I was growing up, it was as if nothing happened before 1945. And again, I knew a few things. I knew that my father was supposed to start university in France in the fall of 1939. I knew that he ended up in Casablanca after the fall of France in 1940. I knew that he ended up in England sometime after that, but I had no idea, and there was no one to ask, how did he go from place to place, and how did that affect the person that I knew him to become? And the same thing was true of my uncle. I knew he was in a Siberian Gulag out near Vladivostok, and I heard, again, inadvertently, that at some point he was in Budapest and he got shot. How did he get from across 3,000 plus miles? How did he get shot? What did that do to him? So the impetus to this was to basically, after basically everyone had died and there was no one to ask, was to try and figure it out by my imagination.
So you did research as well?
Yeah.
So like a family history kind of research plus your imagination then?
Well, the family history was very, very skimpy. I sort of put it in the analogy that they were tent poles around which I wrote the story. What the research was to fill the space in between. Like what happened to people, to other people. Like, for example, on the Russian side, the Russians invaded Poland a couple of weeks after the Germans did, and they took a portion of it, and then they took a good number of the people in the occupied territory from Poland that they didn't like, and if they didn't shoot them, they shipped them off to Siberia, and my uncle happened to be one of those people. So there are books, as well as memoirs, first-person accounts, by people who underwent that. Again, same thing. In 1941, when Germany turned around and invaded Russia, Russia decided that the people that they had taken in 1939 were no longer enemies, so they let them go. and they were supposed to wander through Russia to join up. The Polish people were supposed to join up with a Polish army that was heading towards Iran and eventually to Palestine. So I read a lot about what happened in the Gulag, in that release story, etc. And then the imagination was putting the characters that I knew my uncle and father to be in that situation and writing it in the third person as if they were there. So there was some family history, but the point of this was there wasn't a lot of family history to base it on. There were like these facts and a lot of space in between, and that's what I filled up with research.
Well, I understand that. I had to do some stuff from the 20s, and you kind of have to fill it in. And a lot of times what I did was I would take old newspapers and read and kind of fill in with, you get to see how they lived. Like when you talk about traveling, how did people travel back then? How did, when they get up, how did they live? Did they have power in their house? Did they have running water? Were they able to have a hot shower every day? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot of things you have to put together to really get into the mindset and understand what times were in a long time ago.
Exactly. And the meta of it, like what the armies were doing and what the politicians were doing are what you read in the history books, but it doesn't necessarily or very often affect the individual on the ground. And so what you want to read about is, as you say, is the newspaper stories or the memoirs or the self-published memoirs. Those were great. People who published their own stories for their families, and they'd be collected in a library somewhere. You read those. And example, as I said, my uncle was in a camp near the Pacific, and he ends up in Budapest. He was supposed to go to join this army in Iran, but he didn't do it. Well, why? Well, nobody ever told me. But I read in two different places about people like my uncle who had been released and were heading in that direction. And when they got to the place in the Soviet-Iran border where they were gathering up these people to put them into the army, there was a small group that were maintaining the anti-Semitism and refusing to allow Jews to enlist. Now, not all of them, but it happened enough that I read about these two occasions, and that became a plot point. I said, okay, I had him try to join because he really wanted to, and then he got refused, and so he kept going. So it's that you incorporate that stuff.
And so going through this whole process, learning about your family and a lot of the history and all of this, and then putting together the book, it's done, it's published now. When you look back at it from when you started to now, how do you think this whole process has changed you?
In a simplistic way, it made me appreciate writing more. Many of us think, oh, I can write. I've written a letter, I've written a memo, and the craft is much more challenging and rewarding than that. So it took me 10 years to write and rewrite and reject and rewrite. And so I really do appreciate what it takes to write. But at a more fundamental level, may have been my goal subconsciously, but I got to understand who my family members were, particularly my uncle and my father, and to appreciate what they went through without necessarily needing them to be heroes. I got to know them, if you will, in my 50s and 60s, not when I was a kid. So I didn't have to have put somebody on a pedestal, then knock them down and build them back up again, like sort of the normal father-son cycle, if you will. Part of the challenge was for thinking, well, what would I have done? The circumstance where in France and I'm supposed to start university and suddenly I'm completely cut off from my home. Could I think? Could I survive? And then what does that do to you? I learned a lot about my family without actually knowing the facts.
Is your mother French?
No, my mother was born in what's now Lviv in Ukraine. It was part of Poland in between the wars, so she considers herself Polish. But no, I put two female characters in because I felt it was for both of the protagonists. It helped the plot, but it also helped the complexity of the situation. It could have been a little too simple, like, you fight this battle, you go into this trip, it could have been too linear, And I wanted to explore how they were developing and what this was doing to them psychologically, and it helped to have a couple of female characters to play that off of. But those are completely made up.
So your mother is not Alicia.
No.
Yeah. I got you. So, like in my fiction novels, I am romantically challenged, so I have the hardest time doing that.
It probably was the hardest. I mean, it's easier to write what you know, and I don't know what it's like to be a woman. So
yeah, right. So do you have beta readers? Did you have anyone to help you?
Yes, I had several who were fantastic. I wanted to write when I was a teenager. I wrote my first novel when I was 14. It was awful. It doesn't exist anymore. And then I wrote some other stuff. And then when I went to college, I was actively discouraged from pursuing anything that wasn't medicine. And so when I came back to it, I felt 40 plus years later, I was very concerned that it was late and I didn't have any talent, nothing like that. I went to one of those, I call it a writing camp, but basically it was a seminar at a workshop at a college for 4 or 5 days. And I worked with one well-published writer and a bunch of others, and they became my beta readers, and they were just wonderful.
I have to say, so when you go through all this and you've learned all this stuff and put together the book, what is it do you look at your dad in a different way? Do you see him differently?
Yes. I think that's the most profound thing that came out of it was I tended, and I don't think I'm unusual, to make assessments or judgments about my parents at different times of my life, not always complimentary. I tended to think of my father as, I don't want to use the word cowardly because that doesn't fit, but he very much tried to not call any attention to himself whatsoever. He just wanted to stay quiet and circumscribed, and I never saw him in a fight or an argument with anybody, and I couldn't reconcile that with somebody who fought to survive the circumstances that he did during the war. And he's not unusual in this respect, but he's the only father I have. So now I look at him as someone who did what he needed to do when he needed to do it, and then when he didn't need to do it anymore, he dropped it.
I tell you, I'm the antithesis of your father. I like to be in front of the camera. I want everybody to know what's going on.
And so now I have to also ask about the title, Walk the Earth as Brothers. Now it's got to have a significant meaning here, right?
It was more, well, the story on that one was that I was looking for something that gave some hint of what the book was about. And I was looking at, I was Googling all sorts of things and there was nothing specific that this didn't come from any history. This came from sort of looking for some sort of phrase. And I knew the book was about brothers. And so I looked up, where do they mention brothers in the Bible? And, okay, they do. Nothing fit. And then I came across a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., and it's very similar to this one, about how, we've learned to fly in the air like birds, we've learned to swim in the sea like fish, but we haven't learned to walk on the earth as brothers yet. And I liked it a lot, because it talks about how, this was a whole world war. It talks about walking, which is a more peaceful and deliberate rhythm, and it talks about brothers, and I just thought it just took the whole book. I did a little more research and discovered that Dr. King had gotten, I don't know if he'd gotten it, but it had been published several times before he used it in his Nobel Prize winning speech. The original one that I could trace it back to was a Russian, Maxim Gorky. So it's been used several times, but it just fit beautifully. I originally was going to call it Brothers in Arms, but because of the idea that even though my family seemed to try to keep themselves as close and and keep the world at bay, they were very close to each other, and they basically wrapped themselves up in each other, and they became their whole social circle and their whole support group, and everybody else was politely tolerated, but they weren't that close. So Brothers in Arms worked really well, but the Dire Straits song, the lyrics don't fit at all. And so I abandoned Brothers in Arms.
So what do you hope people take away from this book when they take it out and read it?
That young people have dreams, many of them. I haven't found it written as much, but I'll ask you guys, did you when you were younger ever imagine yourself like secretly before you fall asleep, like winning the race or sinking the basket or getting the prize, like just daydreaming about it? Yeah.
Oh yeah, Michael for sure. Me, no.
Okay.
Always. See, I'm a narcissist, okay?
All right. So you're still doing
It's all about me. Yes.
and so, like, and I know I believe we all do it with, some more than others. So what happens when, any kind of life, it doesn't have to be war, it could be you don't have the resources or somebody in the family gets sick, thwarts that. What does that do to your psyche, to your development? And how do we, and from the perspective of learning about that person, how do we understand them better? But also from the perspective of being familiar with that person, how do we understand them better? And it's not forgive them, at least support them. Like say, yeah, you didn't achieve what you dreamt you'd achieve, but you did something else that was just as valuable. It just didn't match what you thought you were going to do when you were 15.
Yeah, there you go, Michael. So you're not a complete loser.
And you still have time.
See? Yes. I have another question is, when the brothers back up, were they curious to see if they've changed because of the last 10 years? Was that an issue?
They were very gentle with each other because they knew that it had been a lot of trauma. And so they didn't press. They just allowed each of them to share and understand, and then agreed to lock it away. As I said, the book finishes in the mid-50s because that's the point at which they sort of put everything in that happened. They reveal everything to each other, and then they put it away, and then they go on with their lives. In a sense, as if nothing happened, but in another sense, as if it all happened and it all affected them. They just don't talk about it.
Doesn't that kind of lead to, really the whole baby boomer generation having a PTSD in a sense?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a Holocaust survivor. It could have been, somebody. I mean, it was a lot of the people who fought in Patton's army or in desert, in Alamein or something like that. A lot of them had this, and they just came back, and you just didn't talk about it. You went on, except
like Vietnam. You hear people, they just don't talk about it.
Yeah, but it had an effect.
Of course it did, and even on the family and the children, because a lot of the fathers didn't really get close with the sons in the same way, They were tougher on them, and there was I don't want to say abusive, but more of an aggressive way fathers had from that generation on the boomers. You know what I'm saying? It was more strict, more disciplined, more. I just, growing up in the time, I remember seeing it was much more. Discipline is a really good word. It's structured.
There was more expectations and more demands. Because in a sense it was like, nobody said it back then. You don't know how good you had it. Nobody said it that way. It was more like, just go do your duty as a child or as a grown up. That's what we did. One of the things about writing about the Second World War that is a lot easier than writing about now is that there's a very nice black and white. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? You don't get conspiracy theories about how Hitler was actually okay because everybody knew it and everybody agreed.
Yeah, and that's actually probably true. If it was nowadays, or if they had social media, they'd have good propaganda about Hitler being, they'd have him with children and hanging out. Yeah, he's a nice guy. Look at him.
That's his dog. I mean,
Yeah. There's good people on both sides, right? He'd be having a good old time. Look at this guy. He's a nice guy. Well, that's sad anyway. But, we have to wait and see. So are you going to continue this type of writing? Are you going to kind of keep in the historical fiction area, or are you going to do something different?
No, the one I'm working on now, strangely enough, is about a virologist who discovers a way to prevent coronavirus, but somebody hacks his memoirs and starts feeding them back to him with a different perspective, and he thinks that it's these conspiracy theorists who are trying to destroy him and threaten his Nobel Prize.
There we go. So we walked right into it, and we didn't know.
I didn't want to say anything. We're ready for one break.
That's right.
There you go. See, I tell you.
Haven't got a name for it yet, so it's still in the early stages. I've got him in the jungle looking for the rock that secretes the mineral that blocks the coronavirus.
You have to have quite the imagination in that. When you write these characters, like in this book, even though it was your father and uncle and that kind of, do you actually have a relationship with characters?
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like when you write fiction, you can sort of see them, hear them, feel it. You picture them somewhat, right?
Yes.
How is it when you're writing about real people like this and doing it fictionally? Is it the same experience?
Yes, I believe it was, because I was looking at them at a different time in their lives. I didn't know my uncle or my dad when they were 19. I knew them when they were I became aware of them, and when they had me late. So when I was, let's say, 10, my dad was in his mid-40s, and so they had some basis of who they were present back then. But part of the whole point of this was to imagine, how did they evolve to where I got to know them? What were they like back then? And so they were new and different people, and with some core traits that held true. But that's part of the fun of writing, is in disappearing. I think it's analogous to what actors talk about when they talk about getting into a role, where you're still yourself, but you become partly the person you're playing. That's what I felt.
Unless you're doing the Marlon Brando, where you actually live as the character the whole time that you're doing it, whether you're at home or not.
Yeah, I don't think my wife would tolerate that.
Yeah.
So is this going to be a screenplay then?
The which one? The brothers book or the virologist?
Well, actually both.
I don't know that the brothers book can do that, because it is a dual. It's an intertwined two-story timeline, and it doesn't have doesn't come to necessarily the climactic battle. The virologist one has potential. They already done Contagion, but this one's more Contagion meets Social Network or something like that.
That's all right. Let Hollywood have it for a while. They'll add things and they'll make it work.
Oh yeah. Have you ever had anything done by the? Have they ever taken one of yours and changed it? Yes.
Yeah, the very first one. Terrible. It was funny because at the time I was really upset and frustrated and pacing the whole week down in L.A. doing this thing. And later, after talking to a few other people, I started to realize that they need to do what they need to do in order to keep their watchers. They know what they have to do. They in their mind, they were doing it to keep the viewers, so they cut out a lot of things that were important, but weren't important for their viewers. Do you know what I mean? And after a while, you start to go, well, I guess that's just what they do. And, so I thought I'd approach it more cautiously, but every opportunity I get, I go for it.
I remember writing, you write your novel or your book in past tense, but the screenplay is present tense. So that was a challenge for me, was to convert it to present tense.
Wow. I didn't think about that. You're right. I mean, I'm challenged now by going from third person to first person.
Yeah. Well, it takes a long time. And the thing is, too, there's a different way of writing when you're in, because the actors have to carry off the characters in a lot of things that you don't, that you have to write about in a book that you don't necessarily in the screenplay. It's a different type of writing, but I think you can do it easily. I think, you did the hardest work right now. It's behind you. And, the other's adaptable. It's pretty, it's like you've learned to drive a stick shift and now you go to an automatic.
Well, part of my challenge is that I'm 68 and I've got this book that I'm writing now and I've got another one after that. And it's not going to take me 12 years to do these two, but, I figured that they're going to take me 2-3 years each. And, I don't have a lot of time.
You'd be surprised. I found that as I write now, I do things at a much quicker rate because you just know how to look for things, how to research, how to write. You know what I'm saying. Yeah. So I also do 5 or 6 projects at a time. I won't do just one because research takes a lot of time, and when you're trying to do things, so sometimes you have to wait for some sort of evidence or things to write about, and so I want to keep busy. So, that's me. Yeah. But I think you'll get faster each time you do things. Yeah. Well, this is great. So listen, now let's talk about your social media, your website, and all that stuff. So how do people find Henry?
Oh, well, I have a Henry Rozycki, henryrozycki.com, so you have to spell it correctly. And the book's available on all the normal channels, both local bookstores. Please don't forget your local bookstores. They can order it. You can order it through indie bookstores. Indigo can do it in Canada, the old Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And they'll be, right now it's only in hardcover. The paperback's not going to come out until May. Sorry. And there's a Kindle version through Amazon. And it was exciting. There's a picture on my Instagram feed of me crying when I opened the box. I was 14 when I dreamt of this, and then I was 55 when I started, and 67 when it opened the box.
And you don't look a day over 34.
Yeah. Industry stuff. Yeah. It's amazing what Photoshop can do. Or AI, even better.
Yeah, we're seeing that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, and social media, can people follow? Do you like to interact with readers?
I've got a couple of, there's a form you can fill out on the website, and I will respond. I'd be very happy to. And I do have Henry Rozycki Writes is my Instagram handle, and I'll be very happy to interact with people because it's fun. You get to learn things.
Okay, well, so we'll put all of that up on the website so people can find you and find the book. And we appreciate you coming on and talking. It's been good.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been fun.
And the book, the book, Walk the Earth as Brothers, a novel, Henry Rozycki. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.